Good. So 2 minutes past, we can get started. Welcome again. Today we are going to look at new data developed and analyzed by Trase together with ICV, Institute Center and Life, free translation to Portuguese, from Portuguese to English, and also in collaboration with Imaflora. They have looked at soy farms in the Amazon and Cerrado biome in Brazil and tried to understand their level of compliance with the Brazil Forest Code and the implications for EUDR compliance. So this is what this webinar is about, in case you're wondering. We are going to start with a few housekeeping points. First of all, this webinar is happening in English and Portuguese. So we have simultaneous translation and interpretation thanks to our translators here with us. So with that, today we're going to hear from 3 different people. We're going to hear from André Vasconcelos first, who is the Global Engagement Lead at Trase and Global Canopy. Then we're going to hear from André Pereira Dias, who is a coordinator for geoprocessing and environmental monitoring from the environmental department in the state of Mato Grosso in Brazil. And finally, we're going to hear from Salima Kempenaer. I hope I'm saying it more or less right, who is in the Federal Public Service for Public Health in Belgium. And then finally, we'll go to the questions and discussions in our webinar. So before getting started, we wanted to run a quick poll to get a sense from the people in this webinar. So I'm going to read the question in English and in Portuguese. It's just 2 possible answers. The idea of this question is to assess, what do you think is going to be harder for Brazilian soy exporters? Option 1, that the soy that they are sourcing is deforestation free. Or option 2, that the soy that they are sourcing is compliant with relevant national regulations. Em português, vai ser mais difícil, ou é mais difícil para os exportadores brasileiros de soja demonstrarem que a sua soja é, opção 1, livre de desmatamento, ou opção 2, produzida em conformidade com regulamentos nacionais relevantes. Going back to English, we are going to give you some 1 minute, 2 minutes max to put your answer, pretty straightforward in terms of options, and we can take a look at the results. Yeah, that's interesting. So it's not a big difference, but still the majority of the participants here are saying that it probably will be harder to say that the soy is deforestation free. A little bit easier to say it's compliant with relevant national regulations. Very interesting, because this is at the heart of what we're going to discuss right now, and the data that Trase is going to present to us. So with that, I'm going to hand over to André Vasconcelos to present to us the key findings from this study that was developed by Trase, ICV, and Imaflora. André, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm seeing here over 150 people. So that's great that there is interest about this study. I'm going to go through some of the key findings of this study, but we are definitely open to receive any further questions, both at the end of this presentation. Also, if we don't have time to address all of them, please do send us an email, get in touch. So I wanted to start, as Jenny said, to thank our partners and to acknowledge that this research, or this piece of research, was conducted by Trase in collaboration with the Brazilian organization ICV, based in Mato Grosso, with contributions from the Agriculture Atlas program of Imaflora. So the study was developed, or the idea of this study was developed in this context of a new wave of demand-side regulations, which includes the European Union Deforestation Regulation, which is key for our discussion here, but also other regulations that are currently under discussion, for example, in the case of the UK, in the Environmental Act 2021, but also in the US. And what all these regulations or these bills that are being developed have in common is that there is a consensus around compliance of environmental laws of producing countries. And in that context, data and transparency will be key and will be needed to support the implementation. When it comes to the EUDR, there are two main criteria that is requested. So all the relevant commodities and products shall not be placed on the market or exported unless they are deforestation free. This is the Article 3A of the EUDR, and produced in accordance with the relevant legislation of the country of production. And that's exactly the criterion that we will be touch base today. And so this study aims to understand what is the extent that the soy production, both in the Amazon and the Cerrado biomes, comply with key elements of the forest code, and what are the implications for EUDR. I wanted to highlight here that the aim of this study is not only to understand the size of the challenge here, but also to understand what are the opportunities to guide more efforts to support the implementation of both the forest code and the EUDR itself. So just to set the stage here and talk a little bit about the Brazil's forest code, which is definitely the main environmental regulation in Brazil that will be in the spotlight when it comes to the EUDR. So it is the main legal instrument that regulates land use, ensures the protection of forests and other ecosystems in Brazil, and guarantees monitoring of environmental compliance of rural properties in Brazil. But it also introduced a regularization program that allows landowners in breach of the law to rectify their actions and become compliant. So this is a key instrument of the forest code. And here in this study, we assess two key elements of the forest code. One of them is the legal reserve, which is that every single rural property in Brazil, after a certain size, has to set aside a proportion of their land for the protection of the natural resources and biodiversity. And this varies from 20% to 80% according to the biome, the type of native vegetation where the farm is located, and other specific factors. So therefore, the forest code allows for limited deforestation on private lands, providing that landowners first obtain a deforestation license from a competent environmental agency. And that brings us to the next mechanism, which is the deforestation license that we assessed in this study. So it's important to mention that the deforestation license is not only a paper, or it's not a paper, but rather a critical process to achieve sustainable land use in Brazil, including limiting deforestation and reducing the impact of the deforestation. So for a landowner to receive a deforestation license, he has to fulfill several requirements, such as proving that there is no abandoned areas in their property, carrying out field surveys for threatened species, and adopting compensatory measures when threatened species are in place. And therefore, any deforestation that happens without a deforestation license is illegal under the Brazilian law. So just to touch base a little bit on the methodology, we looked at all the soy produced in the Cerrado and in Amazon that are within registered properties, And when I'm mentioning registered properties here, I'm talking about the CAR system in Brazil, which is the first step to achieve compliance with the forest codes. We looked at all the deforestation between 2008 and 2020 within these properties and checked whether or not this deforestation had a license. It's important here to mention that we went all the way back to 2008 because it's the cutoff for deforestation of the forest codes. And all the analysis happened at the farm level because that's the unity of assessment of the forest codes. And I have to say here that ICV had did a tremendous work in accessing or combining all the deforestation license across different states in the Amazon and in the Cerrado by accessing publicly available databases, but also through through formal requests under the Brazil's Freedom of Information law. And with that, we managed to acquire or to have access to a database of 9 states. In the report, in the methodology section of the report, which is a separate document, actually, there is a table that explains what every state what information every state provides, or each state provides, and what's the state's or the level of information when it comes to deforestation license. And we also assessed the legal reserve requirements using the methodology developed by Rajan et al. Under the Rotten Apples article, a scientific paper that was published in 2020, which assess whether these farms or these properties have the minimum vegetation required under the depth or under the legal reserve, and therefore could have a potential deficit of legal reserve. It's important here to emphasize that if a property does have a lack of minimum vegetation within the boundaries of the property, that does not equate to illegality or any irregularity, because the property owners can reforest those areas and therefore go back to compliance, or they can, if the farmers did not engage in deforestation after 2008, they can use the mechanisms set in the forest codes to compensate for the lack of native vegetation within the property. So that's the 2 key elements that we assessed in the study, and I want to jump in straight to the results. So we looked at, or we identified 90 million hectares of soil area in the Amazon and in the Cerrado in 2020. So that's the universe that we are talking about. And we found 16% of that soil was cultivated or produced on farms with strong evidence of non-compliance with the forest codes. And here I'm talking about 3 million hectares. And this evidence is due to both a lack of native vegetation within the property, which gives us a sense of the potential deficit of legal reserve, as well as non-authorized deforestation. 26% was likely compliant because we didn't find any evidence of potential non-compliance. And 58% had a potential risk of non-compliance where more data is needed to verify compliance. This is critical to emphasize here. And it's also critical to break down this box into different aspects. So 18% of that soil was produced on farms where we found evidence of non-authorized deforestation. So summing or adding this 18% to the other 16% that also have non-authorized deforestation, we are talking about 34% of all the soil in 2020 was cultivated in farms where there was non-authorized deforestation between 2008 and 2020. And this 18%, there was only non-authorized deforestation, but not a lack of vegetation under the legal reserves requirements. And 40% of that soil was produced on farms in which there was a risk of non-compliance with legal reserve requirements, because there was a lack of native vegetation or a minimum native vegetation to comply with the legal reserve requirements. But as I mentioned before, that does not equate to any irregularity or compliance, because these farmers can compensate for that lack of native vegetation in other farms, but there is no data available so far to verify that. Which means that under the EUDR, there is a potential risk of 74% of all the soil in Brazil at risk of non-compliance with the EUDR specifically and with the forest codes if the data is not available to prove that compliance. And this has really strong implications for EUDR, because as part of the due diligence obligations, traders will be required to collect conclusive and verifiable information that commodities have been produced in accordance with the relevant legislation of the country of production. This is the Article 9H. But what we are seeing here is the lack of publicly available information makes it difficult for buyers, investors, and consumer markets to systematically verify compliance, and especially when it comes to compensation mechanisms to when farmers did not engage in deforestation after 2008. So there is a lack of information that can be used by buyers, by consumer markets to check compliance, and that means that buyers has to go one by one and ask this information for suppliers, and therefore cannot check compliance at a scale. And what our analysis does is it points out to the areas or to the farms that require further scrutiny, that require further information to prove that those farms are in compliance with the forest code, and or specifically with these key elements. And on the Brazil side, what we need really is the full implementation of the forest code, because we also found that over 95% of that soil in the Amazon and in the Cerrado was deforestation free, meaning that that soil was produced in areas that had not been deforested between 2015 and 2019. Yet, under the EUDR, this soil, deforestation-free soil, around 70% may be affected to comply with the EUDR due to the lack of data and information available to prove compliance. So it's important to mention that a lot of that, as we saw, 40% is related to the legal reserve requirements, and the solutions are already available for that. So there are the mechanisms available. The farmers can restore that. So what we need is information, is access to information to prove that these farmers are in compliance with the law, and really separate the farmers that are in full compliance with the forest code with those farmers that are still in breach of the forest codes. So I think here it's important to highlight a key message for the Brazilian government, which needs to support the soy sector by helping or by implementing the forest codes in full mechanisms. So by validating the CAR, and when the CAR is validated, by providing information which farmer has already engaged in the environmental regularization programs and so on. So then the soy sector, the soy buyers can prove at scale that this soy is in compliance with the forest codes. When it comes to the EU, the EU state members or the enforcement agents will need to process vast amounts of information and deal with many data sets, many different information to check compliance or to verify that soil is actually in compliance. So by targeting products coming from high-risk areas, they can implement the regulation more effectively and allocate their limited resources to products which need more scrutiny. Additionally, I think it's important to highlight here that under the EUDR, they will have to develop the risk benchmarking to benchmark countries and regions in different risks when it comes to deforestation. So here it's important that this risk benchmarking system also take into account not only deforestation, but also compliance with the national environmental laws. Because in some places, we can see that deforestation or it could be high risk for deforestation, but low risk for non-compliance, or high risk for non-compliance and low risk for deforestation. So the EU really needs to support Brazil to strengthen the existing mechanisms and to really implement the forest code. So the EU doesn't need to reinvent the wheel, but rather engaging with the Brazilian government, with the Brazilian soy sector to support the implementation of the full forest codes and therefore with the EUDR. So just to finalize here, what we found actually is that there is a higher risk of non-compliance with the EUDR legality criteria than the deforestation-free criteria. So that answers the poll in the beginning. So actually it was interesting to see that. Just to finalize, the forest code does set all high standards for sustainable land use in Brazil. We have already all the mechanisms in place to have a sustainable land use, but it really needs to be strongly enforced and fully implemented. And now that the EUDR will come into force in the next few months, or the next 12 months or so, it's a great opportunity for both Brazil and the EU and the soy sector to work together because they all share the same goal. And it use this opportunity to really, get the EU and Brazilian government to do the work, their homework in the case of the Brazilian government, but the EU to support the Brazilian government and the soy sector to implement the forest codes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, André. So this is, yes, super interesting presentation, and this is what we are going to have others, like bringing other parts of the information. But basically, like, it's interesting to see that when we think about legality, it's usually quite a binary understanding that just you're either compliant or non-compliant. And in reality, the lack of data can put things in a real perspective. You have like very few farmers that are probably proven to be not doing the right thing and are non-compliant. Very few that we can definitely prove with publicly available information that are doing all the right things, and everybody else in the middle where we don't have enough information to make sure that if they are compliant or not. So I think bringing this point on lack of data and how challenging it is to bring it together, it's quite important and a good bridge to our next speaker. So I'm going to change to Portuguese.
Now, before I hand it over to André, I just wanted to remind you once again that we have a Q&A feature on Zoom. So you can go down to the bottom of the window. We already have a few questions, so maybe, André, you can start answering them about the study. And the rest of the questions, maybe we can submit to the final round of discussions. That said, I'd like to invite André Pereira Dias from the Environmental Secretariat of Mato Grosso to talk a little bit about the data that's available and also the challenges involved in collecting and making these data available. So, André, over to you. Hello, everyone. Congratulations, André. That was wonderful. Great work by ICV. We need to do more of these efforts to identify what's going on. I'm also grateful for the invitation and to be here to talk about what Mato Grosso has been doing vis-a-vis environmental data transparency. We know that the state of Mato Grosso is as complex as it is large. There are 3 biomes, the Amazon, also most of the Cerrado, and also some of the Pantanal wetlands are located in the south of the state, as you can see here. Next slide, please. So, Mato Grosso used to have high levels of deforestation in the past, but between 2004 and 2012, there's been an 89% decrease in deforestation. And this, as you can see here, in 2012, we've reached sort of a stability, a plateau. However, agricultural production has been rising at the same time. So as you can see, crop production and livestock production, they're depicted here in blue and yellow respectively, and they've been going up, whereas deforestation has remained largely stable. So Mato Grosso now accounts for about 1/5 of Brazil's crop production, and out of the 50 municipalities with the highest agricultural production values in Brazil, 26 of them are located in Mato Grosso. Next slide, please.
So, even with these high deforestation rates, Mato Grosso has managed to keep preserved 61% of its native vegetation, which corresponds to an area of a country such as Denmark, New Zealand. So it is still a significant area which is preserved. So as Andre has already mentioned, a lot of this monitoring is done through the Rural Environmental Registry, which is a CAR. Okay, this is a compulsory registration, which allows for the environmental characterization of each rural property in Brazil. So we, through this, know how much legal reserve the property needs to have. The permanent preservation areas are also there, where we have the rivers, and also the areas where agriculture, pasture sort of activities can actually take place. So this registration, this is compulsory, okay? You need to have this for the property. And we also use this to assess the recovery of the environmental liabilities. So they started in the state of Mato Grosso in 2008, but this compulsory registration became a reality for the rest of Brazil in 2012. So this is a very, very, very brief summary of all of this. So when we have, for example, as far as property is concerned, Mato Grosso, the Environment Secretariat, we developed many different reference bases to help assist owners to do their environmental characterization of a property. So we have the sector in charge of looking after all of these reference bases, in addition to all the different authorizations, deforestation, any kind of sort of licensing for forest management. We have the current status of the vegetation, the hydro basin. So all of this, I mean, we use the more recent databases with the best resolution data possible. So all of these sort of databases that we produce, they have metadata, and this is very important because we're able to know what is the source of this data, the methodology of this data being created, and this helps a lot. And here we have studies, we have research, we don't really know that well how the data needs to be used. So in this case, we have all the information of the data. We have a table with all the attributes of the description from the field. So here we have what each field means and how we can use this data in the best way possible. For instance, this is the embargoed areas by the Environment Secretariat. So we have all the information there. So the important thing is for all of these data to be used and may be used by all the different audiences through the Geo portal. And then we have authorization, we have monitoring, oversight data, the embargoes, we have the reference databases, municipal, indigenous lands, water sort of information, environmental registration, water licensing, water grants, and all the other different licenses issued by the Secretariat. And this is an example for you to have an idea. You see here we have the properties that have the authorization to produce. And in red, we have the embargoed areas. So anyone can cross the property, check if that area has any sort of deforestation related embargo, or if they have a license or authorization for deforestation. So in a very simple manner, we are able to cross these different data, and the data has all the different information on the table. We can see the area that has been authorized, the number of the rural sort of registration that they are linked to the license, and other pieces of information. So very quickly, we're able to check whether the soya came from an illegal area or not, for example. And we do this all through this portal, and you may have public access to this, okay? And in addition to the portal of all the different data, we have this warning platform, which is a deforestation and forest degradation alert system. So you can use this QR code. So here you have high resolution images. We use the sort of planet provided for this, and this is done every day. So we are able to map deforestation, and also on the platform we have to do the mosaic month by month. We have the different inclusions, the public platform. I mean, again, there's a public platform, anyone can have access to this, okay? And then we also have help from the Mato Grosso program, and through that you can check the type of warnings, as it were. So we have divided deforestation, degradation, fire, and we do this in a very dynamic way. And you can also use the CAR data from the rural registry. So you have all the registries there, so you can click and check where deforestation took place, for example, degradation, fire. And then you check whether or not they have a license, if this deforested area was done so with a license, and you can get a picture of the before and after. So here you see that they had the authorization for deforestation. So you can easily check if there's deforested area. You can see when it was deforested, whether or not it has authorization, if it is a legal deforestation or not, for example. So, and at the same time, we are now finishing the developing of another platform, and this is going to work as the managing of this warning. So we have the Brazilian Institute We have the Amazon warning. So there's no point trying to have different warning places. So basically, this platform is a way of us to apply spatial intelligence for each warning. So we bring together all the different warnings that we get as per the different classes, the burned areas, fire, selective logging, deforestation, degradation, and these are all free of charge, okay? Images, and this is a platform which is being developed, and we can have the collective management in relation to what happened to each deforestation warning, for example. So these are some of the warning systems that we use. And the idea is to take all of these warnings, these alerts, as it were, we cross it with our reference databases, and then we're going to be able to establish whether or not this is a more recent warning, if the warning comes from a protected area or not. And this is going to allow us to work with the demand of how this demand is taking place. And then all of these warnings, they have an automatic email, and then the owner, for example, you can check the deforestation when it happened, and then depending on the date, the size, you get sort of remote notification, and then some very sort of recent warnings. They are overseen out in the field. So this platform allows us, as in the past, we only quantified deforestation, but then today, at the start of deforestation, when you stop this, okay, this mobile application here, we can rapidly mobilize the field teams to answer the warnings very quickly. These pictures that we take out in the field, we can have this in real time. Andre, you have 1 minute. So for example, this is the monitoring of a land which is deforested in May, and then the owner here, you see they continue to use this, and we can monitor this very quickly. And he is not complying with the embargo. So for instance, if this produces any soya, this is soya produced in an illegal area. So with this methodology that was created, we have managed to, even in the sort of last 4 years, we've managed to destabilize deforestation. Even the federal forces, Mato Grosso has managed to keep stability in this deforestation, but this has increased, for example, the number of embargoed areas, the number of fines issued. For example, at the bottom here, you see what has been seized in 2021, 2022. So we had, tractors, tires, helicopters, for instance, which is the equipment that we've seen. So at the national level, through this platform, we have managed to provide for 62% of all the existing warnings with authorization, whether or not it was embargoed, in comparison to the federal government. And then we were able to answer only for 14.6%. And then we have a sample 2020, 2022. This has gone up to close to 75%. So basically, we are managing to answer all deforestation warnings in the state. And then in these 2 years, almost, I think you said billion, or maybe $1 million was issued in fines. And this really shows the importance of this sort of transparency data. This is critical, for reliability of, the agency. So it's always better to use official data official quality data. So this is a basic requirement for decision makers. So this was very well founded also. This helps in monitoring, and this can also help specific platforms for compliance, for example, in production of timber, of grain. So we are focusing on the continuous improvement of these data, sharing this in a completely open way for everyone. And I thank you very much.
Great, André. That was very, very interesting. It's interesting to see how all of the pieces fit together. We begin with challenges in identifying data and correlating that data. And at the end, the other end of the spectrum, we want the state to be able to use that data, collect it, and use it for monitoring purposes.
We have one more presenter, a panelist with us today. So now I'll hand over to Salima Kempenaer from the FPS Public Health in Belgium to discuss a bit of the questions that buyers and regulatory agents will need to face when assessing compliance, because this is also one of the questions that we have in the Q&A, and then we'll go for questions. So we are already pointing some questions to be answered live. Let's see if we can manage to get through a couple of rounds of questions and answers. Salima, over to you.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this very interesting and important topic. I'm not sure I'll be able to give very concrete answers to what you just mentioned, but maybe more a perspective from an EU member state. So first, let me introduce myself some more and the perspective from which I work on this issue. So I work in the Federal Public Service. This is the Federal Ministry for Environment in Belgium. And I work in a unit that's called Biodiversity and Governance. And it's important to know that we are not the unit responsible for implementing EUDR, although of course we cooperate closely together with those colleagues in the same ministry. So I'm currently chairing the Amsterdam Declarations Partnership for Belgium until the end of this year. It's a voluntary partnership of 10 countries, 8 from the EU, plus Norway and the UK. And the partnership pursues an overall ambition of deforestation-free and sustainable commodities since 2015. So it's mostly a platform for dialogue and cooperation with stakeholders and countries involved in the production and trade of the key commodities linked with deforestation. And although the partnership's original concern is deforestation, it's important not to confuse it or limit it to EUDR, because our work has evolved into a broader perspective on sustainability. And as said, my unit has particular interest in biodiversity, of course, but also as current chair of the ADP, we wanted to prioritize smallholder inclusion and living income, because we know that these are pressing concerns in all producer countries, including Brazil. Now, going into today's topic, what I found interesting in the Trace report is that illegality or non-compliance with national legislations is a key problem. And this is very interesting because most of the focus on EUDR is on the deforestation-free criteria, as we could see in the beginning of the webinar. It's identified as most difficult to comply with. However, well, first, maybe it's not the most difficult to comply with, and more importantly, from our perspective, we can fairly say that the legality criteria is in the end an objective that we have in common with Brazil and with other producer countries. And when I say we, I think I can also include the UK, that also has a legislation on deforestation that includes the legality criteria. So what does that mean? That means that cooperation between all competent authorities from all the countries involved in the trade is essential. Of course, we know that EUDR is challenging, but the current attention to EUDR and other demand-side legislations, and mostly the efforts to comply with those legislation, can be seen as also supportive of national legislation from producer countries, in this case, Brazil. Although, of course, I completely agree with the fact that we need to cooperate. So we all need preparing, that includes us, and you can imagine that we have a lot of work going on to be ready for implementation and enforcement. A lot of the efforts are focused on providing answers to the technical questions that are asked by stakeholders, and they're very, very varied, because we are talking about soy now in this webinar, but there are many other commodities involved, and all the national and more local contexts are very, very, very different from country to another. But we also work on clarifying those aspects of the legislation that need further interpretation. This will take a bit of time, but a lot of colleagues are working on this currently in collaboration with the Commission. And of course, in that context, all questions that are received from whether stakeholders or governments from other countries are welcome. We also need to know our value chains better and their link with a risk of non-compliance. The studies like the ones we have now are very useful for that. And it's important to know that this does not only apply to commodities that we import in the EU, because the obligations also apply to EU producers. And on that aspect also, studies that clarify the value chains and their risk, etc. Sharing knowledge and experience between governments and stakeholders is essential, of course, because time is limited, and of course capacities also. So maybe going into a conclusion, I think it's obvious that we need to reinforce or establish, when it's not existing, close collaboration and cooperation between competent authorities, so as to build capacities, but on a reciprocal basis. You need to realize that EUDR opens a whole new array of challenges for the EU competent authorities as well. So the recognized experience and expertise from governments in Brazil, for example, is very, very useful to us. And it was beautifully illustrated with the presentation from André. But of course, we can't leave aside businesses and representatives from other stakeholders. So with that in mind, and in order to make progress and materialize this need of dialogue and cooperation, I can share a recent initiative that we are building with the help of our embassy in Brasilia. They are very active in fostering dialogue with Brazilian authorities, NGOs, and businesses. And in that context, they have proposed that we launch a type of simulation exercise of the due diligence obligations resulting from EUDR. So concretely, that means that we will collaborate with volunteers from businesses in Brazil and in Belgium that are part of the same value chain and agree with this simulation exercise. And we will, try and translate and sequence the implementation of EUDR with them. So this will be a very useful exercise on both ends, helping to prepare both stakeholders and competent authorities from both sides of the ocean. And we hope to maybe identify, of course, try and give answers, but maybe also identify questions for which we need further work and add it to our current load of exercises that we have to carry out. But maybe I'll stop here to leave some time for the questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Salima. We have lots of questions. Some of them are answered in the Q&A, and we can also, I think, go through a quick round. So I think 1 minute for each of the speakers. There are many questions about the study, which I think André can follow up, and Jolene, André, Trace, people were already following up on. But it will be good, I think, going back to the beginning of this webinar, like from your perspective, like what will be the data, what will be the challenges and data needs to a certain compliance with legal requirements in producing countries? Where do you see the main challenges and opportunities? Like very brief comment, I think 1 minute for each speaker. André Vasconcelos, if you can start.
Thanks, Jani. I think it's important to mention that although in Brazil there are still a few gaps when it comes to data and transparency of this data, Brazil is much ahead of many other producing countries. So in terms of Brazil, answering your question, I think key data sets are the validation of the car, first of all. Then this will allow to know whether the producers engaged in environmental regularization programs or not. This information is not available at all today at scale. Also, if the farmers are compensating any potential deficit of legal reserve that they might have in other farms. So these data sets will be critical to assess whether a given farmer is in compliance with the legal reserve requirements. Just to complement also deforestation license, some states like Mato Grosso are well ahead, other states still don't provide this information, are very patchy. So having that across different states in a more robust way is key as well.
Yes. André, para você.
Yeah, I agree with my namesake. Mato Grosso is ahead of the other states vis-a-vis the CAR, the environment, the rural registry. We are ahead of other states. Most other states don't have the level of transparency we have been able to achieve here in Mato Grosso. So we need to train the other states so they can get up to that level of monitoring. And there's another point. We also need to be aware of the producers who abide by the law, abide by the regulations. We don't have that. We don't have enough support for those who do the right thing. People who deforest and do so illegally, they enjoy amnesty, leniency in Brazil, to the detriment of people who abide by the regulations.
Super. Salima, in your view?
Well, I think I have to answer more globally than just for Brazil, because I think on our side the challenge will be the number of legislations that will need to be known, identified, and enforced in a way by our competent authorities. So many countries, so many different contexts, so many different levels of governance. So I think it's this aspect that will be very difficult. Of course, then those countries who
I think we're having a technical glitch right at the end. We lost you. Yeah, we lost you for 20 seconds.
But
well, you have 20 seconds to wrap up, and I'll just share closing remarks. Sorry, we lost your audio for a few seconds. You hear us? Well, I need to wrap up. So thank you so much for joining. As I said, this webinar will be available in YouTube very soon in Portuguese and in English. I want to thank again André Vasconcelos, André Dias, and Salima Kempenaer for your amazing insights. It's a very interesting discussion and it will continue definitely. Before you go, I will only ask you to please fill out the short survey that will appear in your web browser after this webinar. Your feedback is super helpful for Trase to keep improving future webinars. Thank you so much to you all, and I wish you a good rest of your day.